The microphone was warm in my hand from the best man's speech that had just ended, and the room was still laughing at the last joke, that particular loosened laughter of a wedding reception that has hit its stride. And I looked out at 214 people, some of whom I had known my whole life, and some of whom I had met for the first time 3 days ago. And I found my parents in the crowd, and what I saw on their faces made me decide, in the space of about 4 seconds, to say the thing I had been not saying for 11 months. My mother was looking at her plate. My father had the expression he gets when he is working very hard not to show that something is wrong. The expression I have known since I was 7 years old. The specific compression of his face that happens when he is containing something he does not want to put on the room. He was sitting at table 11. Table 11 was at the back of the ballroom, the table farthest from the dance floor, the table that was technically inside the reception venue and was also, in every way that matters, at the edge of it. The table closest to the door, the table that had been assigned to them by the seating chart that Darren's mother Patricia had organized, the seating chart that I had asked to be involved in and had been told was handled, the seating chart I had not seen until the day before the wedding, when the cards were already printed and Patricia had fanned them out on the dining table of the house where Darren had grown up, like a completed project. And I had looked for my parents' names and found them at table 11, next to Darren's father's accountant and 2 cousins I had met once at an engagement party, and I had opened my mouth and Patricia had said the tables near the front are all family and the rest were done by relationship to the couple, and Darren had been standing in the doorway and I had looked at him and he had made the expression that I had been seeing for 11 months. The expression that said, "Please not, tonight please," and I had closed my mouth. That was the day before the wedding. This is the wedding. The microphone was warm in my hand, and I looked at table 11, and I decided, my name is Sophia Okafor Hayes, and I am 31 years old, and I want to tell you everything. Not just the 4 minutes at the microphone, but the 11 months that made those 4 minutes necessary. Because those 4 minutes were not spontaneous. They were not impulsive. They were the culmination of 11 months of swallowing things that should not have been swallowed. And if you have ever stood at a microphone or a dinner table or a doorway and said the thing you had been not saying, you will recognize what I am describing. You will recognize the specific quality of a moment, when the cost of staying quiet finally exceeds the cost of speaking. But before I take you back to the beginning, I need one thing from you. Subscribe right now if you are watching this and you have ever had your people, the ones who raised you and showed up for you and drove through traffic and paid for things and made every sacrifice that parents make, made to feel like a footnote at an event that was supposed to honor your life? Because this story is for you and I need you here for the whole of it. Subscribe, hit the bell, and let me take you back. I married Darren Hayes 14 months ago at the Grand Meridian in downtown Chicago, in a ceremony that I had been dreaming about in the general way that people dream about their wedding since I was a girl and in the specific way that I had been planning since Darren proposed at the restaurant. We went to on our 3rd date, which is a detail I love, because it means the place is both the beginning and the milestone, and for 12 months before the wedding, I was the happiest I had ever been about something that had not yet happened, which is its own specific form of happiness that I recommend, if you can find it. Darren is a good man. I want to say that before I tell you anything else because everything I am about to say exists inside the fact that Darren is fundamentally a good person who loves me and who made choices during the year before our wedding that I believe came from a place of conflict rather than a place of not caring and understanding the source of the choices. Does not make the choices okay, but it does change what they mean and it does change the story I am telling about them. And I think this distinction matters because the easy version of this story, the version that is cleaner and more satisfying, is the version where the husband is simply complicit, where he sees what is happening and chooses his family's preferences over his wife's family's dignity. And that version exists in this story. But it is not the whole of it. The whole of it includes a man who was inside a family system he had never been asked to examine, who loved his mother and feared disappointing her in the specific way of someone who has built their relationship with a parent on not disappointing them, and who kept choosing the path of least resistance because each individual instance seemed manageable, and the pattern was harder to see from inside it than from outside it. Darren's family is from a specific kind of background that I will describe as old Chicago money, without being more specific because the specifics are not the point. The point is the specific culture that background produces, which is a culture of assumption, a culture in which the people inside it assume without examining the assumption that the way things are done in their world is the way things are done, that their preferences constitute not preferences but standards, and that any deviation from those standards is not a different preference but a lesser one, and this culture is not malicious. I want to be clear about that. It is not assembled from cruelty. It is assembled from the long accumulation of a family operating inside a world that has consistently confirmed their version of events, a world that has never asked them to examine the assumption because the examination has never been necessary for their comfort, and comfort, extended across generations, produces a confidence that looks from the inside like good taste and looks from the outside like the specific willingness to override another family's culture without quite registering that you are doing so. Patricia Hayes, Darren's mother, operates at the center of that culture with the confidence of someone who has never seriously been asked to question it. She is not a villain. I want to be clear about that too, because I have thought carefully about how to describe her, and villain is not the right word. The right word is something more like a woman who has organized her entire life inside a set of assumptions she has never had to examine because no one inside her world has ever asked her to, and meeting me, who comes from a completely different world with completely different assumptions, produced in her not curiosity but a kind of low-grade management. A persistent, quiet effort to bring my world into alignment with hers, expressed most clearly in what she did with the wedding. My parents, Adaeze and Chukwuemeka Okafor, are Nigerian-American. They emigrated from Lagos when my mother was 23 and my father was 27, and they built in Chicago in the South Side neighborhood where I grew up. A life that I can only describe as extraordinary in the way that lives built on the specific combination of love and sacrifice and discipline are extraordinary, which is quietly and without announcement and in the accumulated evidence of 31 years of everything they made possible. My father has a PhD in electrical engineering and has been on the faculty at the University of Illinois for 22 years. My mother is a pediatrician with a practice she built from nothing in a neighborhood that needed one. They are not people who need to be explained or introduced or managed. They are people who walk into rooms and fill them with the specific weight of people who have done real things with their lives and who are comfortable in their own skin. And when Darren brought me home to meet Patricia for the first time, I watched Patricia look at my parents with the particular expression of a woman who is recalibrating something, taking in information that does not fit the category she had prepared. And I filed that expression in a place where I file things I do not yet have full language for. The planning started 11 months before the wedding when Patricia called me on a Tuesday evening and said she wanted to sit down and talk about the reception, that she had some ideas she wanted to share, and I said, of course, I love ideas. I said it genuinely, because at that point I was still operating on goodwill and the assumption that the conversation would be collaborative, that ideas would be exchanged and considered, and that the wedding that came out of the process would reflect both families, and it was a reasonable assumption for a woman to make when her future mother-in-law calls to discuss the wedding. It was the assumption that most people who have not yet been inside a specific family's culture would make, and I made it, and I was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not in the way that produces a single recognizable betrayal, but gradually wrong in the way that you are. Gradually wrong when you keep assuming collaboration and keep receiving management, when each individual redirection can be explained away and the pattern reveals itself only slowly, the way patterns do when you are inside them rather than looking at them from outside. That assumption was incorrect. Patricia's ideas were not ideas in the collaborative sense. They were plans. The venue was the Grand Meridian, which Darren's parents had used for his sister's wedding 6 years earlier and which Patricia described as the only real option for an event of this kind in Chicago. And when I mentioned the possibility of a different venue, a restaurant with private event space, that my parents and I had visited together and loved, Patricia said it was charming but not quite what was needed for a wedding of this scale. And when I asked what scale she meant, she described a guest list that was approximately 40% larger than the one Darren and I had discussed. I said, Patricia, Darren and I talked about keeping this to around 150 people. She said, of course, but there are certain people who really do need to be included for the family's sake. I said, whose family? She smiled. She said, everyone's family, of course. and the specific quality of that smile, and the specific way the word everyone covered a population that I would later understand was almost entirely the Hayes family's social and professional network, was the first clear signal that the wedding Patricia was planning and the wedding I was planning were not the same wedding. I brought this to Darren that night. Darren is the kind of person who processes things slowly and thoroughly and who does not like to reach a position before he has thought through all the angles, which is a quality I love in him in most contexts, and which in the context of his mother produced, across the 11 months of wedding planning, a consistent pattern that I will describe as sympathetic paralysis, meaning he understood what I was describing, he agreed in principle with my position, and he was not able to act on it in the moment because the moment always involved his mother, and his mother was, to Darren, a force of nature that he had spent 33 years learning to navigate rather than confront. He said, "Let's just see how it goes." I should tell you that the phrase, "let's just see how it goes," is the phrase I heard most often in the 11 months of planning, in response to every concern I raised, in response to the guest list, in response to the seating chart, in response to the menu, which had been decided in a meeting I was not invited to, in response to the rehearsal dinner invitation list, which included 42 of the Hayes family's extended network and 7 people from my family and had been printed before anyone asked me to review it, in response to every moment where the wedding that was being planned diverged. From the wedding I had imagined, Darren said, "Let's just see how it goes." The menu meeting was the moment when I understood with full clarity what was happening, not as a series of individual decisions that could each be explained by logistics or oversight, but as a pattern, a consistent and directional pattern, the direction of which was away from my family's presence and culture and toward the Hayes family's preferences and standards. The menu meeting happened without me because Patricia had scheduled it for a Tuesday when I had a standing work commitment that she had been told about, and the meeting produced a dinner menu that was entirely French-inspired, with no acknowledgement of the Nigerian food traditions that my parents had grown up with, that I had grown up eating at every significant family event of my life, that my mother had asked specifically if she could contribute to the catering conversation, and when I say contribute, I do not mean control or redirect or make demands. I mean the specific, modest request of a woman who wanted the food at her daughter's wedding to include something from the culture she had spent 40 years carrying across an ocean and building into a life in a new country, something that said this family was here, this culture was here, this history was part of this day. When I found out about the menu, I called Patricia and I said I wanted to talk about it, and she said the caterer had already been confirmed and that there were contractual complexities to changing anything now, but that we could certainly look at including some additional items, and she said the word additional in the way that makes a thing sound supplementary rather than equal, and I said I wanted Nigerian dishes to be a meaningful part of the dinner menu, not a supplementary feature, and she said she understood and she would look into it, and she never mentioned it again, and neither did Darren, after I told him, because Darren said, "Let's just see how it goes." The dish appeared at the reception as a single small appetizer station set up away from the main dinner service, labeled in small handwritten text, and it was the first thing my mother saw when we arrived at the venue for the final walkthrough. And she looked at it, and she looked at me, and she said, "This is lovely, baby," with the specific grace of a woman who has spent a lifetime being the bigger person in situations that did not require her to be, and has decided not to stop now. I looked at that appetizer station, and I thought about what I wanted to say, and I said, "It's not what I asked for, Mom." She said, "I know." She said, "It's okay." It was not okay, and we both knew it, and she was choosing not to make it harder for me by saying so, and I was choosing to hold the thing she was not saying and the thing I was not saying, and we walked through the rest of the venue together with that held thing between us. The day before the wedding, the seating chart. I have already told you about the seating chart. Table 11, the table at the back of the ballroom near the accountant and the cousins I had met once. I want to tell you something about what a seating chart communicates, because I think some people receive a seating chart as a logistical document and some people receive it as a social document, and the difference between those two interpretations is the difference between seeing a table assignment as a question of space management and seeing it as a statement about who matters at this event. And I receive seating charts as social documents because I have attended enough events to understand that where you put people says something about how you see them. My parents, who had funded a significant portion of this wedding, who had flown, and my grandmother and 2 aunts from Lagos, and my 2 uncles from Houston, and my cousin from Toronto, and who had contributed to this day in every way a family can contribute, were at table 11. Patricia's accountant was at table 11. I looked at Darren in the doorway. He made the expression. I closed my mouth. I carried it to the wedding day. The ceremony was beautiful. I want to say that plainly because it is true and because the ceremony was ours, Darren's and mine, and what happened at the reception does not retroactively undo the beauty of standing across from my husband in the space we had filled with people we loved and saying the words we had written for each other in the months before, and Darren cried when I walked in, and I cried when I got to him. And none of that was performance, that was the thing itself. The thing underneath all the planning, and the seating charts and the menu meetings, the actual love that was the reason for the day. The reception was where it accumulated. The speeches came in the order Patricia had determined at a planning session I had not attended, which was Darren's best man, then Darren's sister, then Patricia herself, who had prepared a speech that was 11 minutes long and that covered the Hayes family history and Darren's childhood in a way that was loving and eloquent, and that contained 2 passing references to me and no reference whatsoever to my family. 11 minutes, 2 mentions. My father, who had asked to speak at his daughter's wedding, had been told by Patricia that the speech schedule was already full, but that there would be an open mic portion later in the evening where he was very welcome to say a few words. My father, who has delivered keynote addresses at international engineering conferences and who taught me to love language by reading to me every night of my childhood until I was old enough to read to myself, had been assigned the open mic portion of his daughter's wedding reception. I watched him sit through Patricia's 11-minute speech with his hands folded on the table and his face arranged into the controlled expression. And I watched my mother put her hand over his, and I watched them at table 11 at the back of the ballroom, near the accountant and the cousins I had met once. The best man's speech ended, the room laughed. The microphone was passed to the next person in the program, which should have been the open mic, which should have been the moment my father stood up, except that Patricia had leaned across to the MC during the applause and said something I could not hear, and the MC had nodded, and instead of the open mic, another member of the Hayes extended family stood up and took the microphone and began speaking about his memories of Darren from summer camp 20 years ago. And that was the moment, not the menu, not the seating chart, not the 11-minute speech with 2 mentions. The moment my father was moved aside for a man who had known Darren at summer camp was the moment the accumulated weight of 11 months tipped past the point where staying quiet cost more than it gave. I stood up. I walked to the front of the room. I put my hand on the arm of the summer camp man, who stopped mid-sentence and looked at me with the polite confusion of someone who does not yet understand what is happening. And I said, "I'm so sorry. I just need one moment," in the tone I use when I am being absolutely clear that I need the moment, regardless of how it is received, and he handed me the microphone and sat down. The room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something unscheduled is happening, and the guests are trying to determine whether it is a planned unscheduled thing or an actually unscheduled thing or an actually unscheduled thing. I looked at the microphone. I looked at the room. I found Darren's face. He was looking at me with an expression I had not seen from him before, something that was not the sympathetic paralysis and was not the please not tonight, something that was more alert than either of those, something that looked like a person who has understood that a threshold has been crossed and is now watching to see what comes next. I looked at table 11. My father was sitting very still. My mother had her hand on the table. I said, "Good evening, everyone." 214 people said, "Good evening" back, in the slightly uncertain unison of a crowd that is being polite while it figures out the situation. I said, "I want to take a few minutes and I want to ask you all to stay with me, because there's something I want to say to some people in this room who I have not said it to loudly enough, and I want to say it here, in front of everyone, because that is the only way it means what I need it to mean." I looked at table 11. I said, "My parents are here tonight." I said it in the direction of the room, but it was aimed at the back of it, at the table near the door, at the 2 people who had been sitting there since the reception started being managed around them, rather than for them. I said, "My father, Dr. Chukwuemeka Okafor, is a man who has published 47 research papers in electrical engineering, who has mentored 112 graduate students in 22 years at the University of Illinois, and who taught me to read by sitting on the edge of my bed every night of my childhood with whatever book I had asked for and reading it with me in the specific voice he uses when he wants you to understand that the words matter, that the story matters, that the story matters, that you matter." I paused. I heard the room. I said, "My mother, Dr. Adaeze Okafor, built a pediatric practice in a neighborhood that needed one and has been giving children and their families the specific gift of a doctor who sees them, and I mean sees them in the full sense, who comes from the community and speaks to them in their own language and treats the whole person rather than the presenting symptom. For 23 years, and she has done this while also raising a daughter who she taught by example every single day what it means to be fully present for the people who need you." I felt my voice catch on that last sentence, and I let it catch because I was not going to manage it away. I was going to say the thing at full volume with the full feeling attached, and I did not need to make it smaller to make it palatable. I said, "These two people have been at this wedding all evening." I said, "They have been at this wedding, sitting at table 11 near the back of this beautiful room, and I want to stand here and correct that, not by moving the tables, but by saying out loud in front of everyone in this room that the two people sitting at table 11 are the reason I exist, are the reason I became someone worth marrying, are the reason I know what a good life looks like, and they belong at the center of this day, not at the edge of it." I said, "My mother did not ask for a station at a wedding. She asked to contribute to a menu. She asked for her culture to be present at her daughter's wedding in the same way that the family she was marrying into had their culture present at every turn, in the venue and the food and the flowers and the 11-minute speech that covered the Hayes family history with the thoroughness of a guy family historian and the brevity of 2 mentions of the woman whose wedding this is supposed to be." I said that last sentence, knowing exactly what it would do to the room, and I said it anyway because I was not standing at that microphone to make anyone comfortable. I was standing at that microphone to say something true, and the truth sometimes produces discomfort in the people it describes, and that is not a reason to withhold it. The room was very quiet in a different way now, not the polite quiet of the opening, but the specific quality of quiet that comes when a room understands. It is hearing something that is not on the program and is deciding how to receive it. I heard Darren's chair shift behind me. I did not turn around. I said, "I have been holding this for 11 months because I did not want to make this harder than it needed to be, because I love my husband and I did not want the planning of our wedding to become a battlefield, and because I have been told, in various ways and with various degrees of directness, that this is how these things are done, that there are standards, that there are traditions, and I have tried to respect that, even when respecting it meant swallowing things that should not have been swallowed." I said, "But here is what I know." I said, "My parents did not raise me to be swallowed." I said, "My father did not spend a decade building a research career and 2 decades building students into scholars so that his daughter would end up at a microphone at her own wedding explaining his credentials to a room full of people who should have already known them." I said, "My mother did not build a practice from nothing in a neighborhood that needed one so that her culture would be reduced to a single appetizer station at the edge of the dinner service." The room had the quality of held breath. The room was very quiet. I said, "Dad?" I looked at my father. I said, "I know you were asked to speak in the open mic portion." I said, "I would like you to speak now." I held the microphone toward the back of the room. He stood up. He walked to the front. My father, 61 years old, Nigerian-American man who had built his life out of discipline and intelligence and the specific grace of someone who has spent a lifetime operating with excellence in rooms that were not always ready for him. And he took the microphone from me. And he looked at the room, and he looked at Darren, and he looked at me, and he said, "My daughter." He said it the way he has said it my whole life, not as an address, but as an acknowledgement. The way you say the name of something you are grateful for, and the room heard the weight in it. The room heard what those 2 words carried, and then he spoke for 7 minutes, and I will not tell you everything he said because it belongs to us, to him and to me, But I will tell you that he talked about the day I was born and what he thought when he first held me, and he talked about the specific hope he and my mother had brought to this country with them. The hope of people who leave everything. They know because they believe that what they are going toward is worth what they are leaving behind. And he said that I was the fulfillment of that hope made into a person, and that watching me become the person I had become was the thing that told him the leaving had been worth it, and that he wished us the kind of love that his parents had modeled for him, and that he and my mother had tried to model for me. The love that is also friendship, the love that is also work, the love that does not require the perfect moment or the perfect venue or the perfect seating arrangement, because it is carried in the people themselves and not in the arrangement of the room. But I will tell you that by the end of it, half the room was crying and the other half was applauding, and Darren was doing both. And when my father finished and handed the microphone back to me, my mother stood up at table 11 and started to walk to the U-Haul front, and the room began applauding before she reached me, and she spoke for 4 minutes. And what she said was about love, the specific kind of love that is also work, the kind that does not take a day off, the kind that does not take a day off, the kind that exists in the reading at bedtime and the doctor's office and the long conversations and the sacrifices that are so embedded in the texture of daily life that the child receiving them does not fully understand them as sacrifices until she is standing at the front of a ballroom holding a microphone and trying to say what they have meant. I handed the microphone to the MC and I walked to my parents and I stood between them, and my father put one arm around me and my mother put one arm around me, and we stood there for a moment, the three of us in the front of the ballroom at a wedding where they had been seated at table 11. Then I turned around and I looked at Darren, and Darren was standing up from his chair, and he walked to where I was standing, and he looked at my parents, and he said, "I owe you an apology." He said it to both of them. He said, "I have watched things happen this year that I should have stopped, and I did not stop them because I was telling myself it would be okay. It would work out. It would not matter as much as it mattered, and I was wrong, and I am sorry. And I want to start tonight differently than we started. Tonight, and I need you to know that." My father looked at Darren for a moment. Then he extended his hand. Darren took it, and my father held it with both hands, the way he holds things he is serious about, and he said, "We start from here. I want to tell you about the rest of the night because I think the rest of the night is as important as the microphone moment. The rest of the night is the thing that tells you whether the microphone moment was a gesture or a change." Patricia found me near the end of the cocktail hour portion that followed the speeches, and she was composed in the specific way that Patricia is always composed, the composure of a woman who has had a long time to make peace with her own authority and who does not easily dismantle it. But underneath the composure, there was something that I had not seen from her before in 11 months of planning and meetings and seating charts and menu discussions, something that looked like uncertainty, the specific uncertainty of a person who has just watched their version of events receive a public response they did not anticipate, and I recognized it as the same recalibration I had watched in her face the first time she met my parents. The adjustment without admission, except that this time the adjustment was larger and more public, and the admission was coming whether she was ready for it or not. I will not describe in detail what she said because some conversations belong to the people who had them, and I am still inside this one in ways that are ongoing. But I will tell you that what she said was not an apology in the clean, unqualified sense. It was an apology in the way that some apologies are, wrapped in context and explanation and the particular self-protective language of someone who was acknowledging that something went wrong without fully accepting that they were the cause of it. And I listened to it and I said, "Patricia, I need us to try something different." And she said, "What do you mean?" And I said, I need my family to be part of this family in the actual sense of the word, not in the sense of being included on guest lists and assigned table numbers, but in the sense that what they bring to this family is valued." And she said, of course she valued my family. And I said, "Then I need you to show me that. Not tonight, but from tonight forward, because what I have seen for the last 11 months has not shown me that." She said she heard me. I do not know yet what she will do with having heard me. I know that Darren and I have had the conversations that we needed to have in the months since the wedding. Not easily, not without the specific friction of two people who love each other and who have also been doing something wrong together and are trying to understand how to do it differently, but honestly, which is the only currency that actually changes anything. I know that my father has had dinner at our apartment 3 times since the wedding, and that the dinner conversation is always long, and that he and Darren have discovered a shared enthusiasm for chess that has become the architecture of a relationship that did not fully have a foundation before. And I watch them across the dinner table sometimes with a specific warmth that I do not have another word for other than relief. The relief of seeing something that should have been happening actually happen. I know that my mother and I talk every Sunday, as we always have, and that what she says about Darren has changed in the year since the wedding. Changed in the direction of knowing him rather than tolerating him, which is the distinction that matters. I know that the microphone moment will not fix everything that was wrong for 11 months. I also know that fixing everything that was wrong for 11 months was not the job of the microphone moment. The job of the microphone moment was to name what had been unnamed, to say out loud in front of everyone what had been allowed to go unsaid, to put my parents at the center of the room in the only way that was available to me. After the seating charts were printed and the menu was confirmed and speeches had already been delivered, which was to walk to the front of a ballroom with a warm microphone and say, "These two people are why I am here, and they belong here, and I will not end this night without saying so." I want to say something to whoever is watching this and nodding. If your people have been seated at table 11, not literally, but in the way that table 11 represents every time the people who raised you were made to feel peripheral at events that should have centered them, I want you to know that you are allowed to say something, not at every moment, not without consideration, not in ways that create more damage than they repair, but at the moment when the cost of staying quiet exceeds the cost of speaking. When you look at your father's face and see the controlled expression, when you watch your mother put her hand over his, when the microphone is warm in your hand and the room is quiet and you can see both of the people who made you sitting at the table near the door, you are allowed to speak. You do not have to be perfect about it. You do not have to have the speech prepared. You just have to say the true thing. The true thing is always enough. My parents drove home after the wedding at 1 in the morning in my father's car, the same car he has driven for 8 years because he does not believe in replacing things that still work. And my mother texted me from the car at 1:15, which is her way of letting me know they arrived safely. And the text said, "We are so proud of you," and then it said, "Not because of the speech." I texted back, "Because of what?" She said, "Because you know what your people are worth." I thought about that for a long time. I still think about it. That is the thing I want to leave you with, not the speech, not the microphone, not the 4 minutes that silenced a room. The thing I want to leave you with is the sentence underneath the speech. The sentence that made the speech possible, which is that I know what my people are worth, and the knowing of it is not something the seating chart could take from me, and is not something the menu meeting could take from me, and is not something 11 months of being managed around could take from me, because the knowing lies somewhere deeper than any of those things could reach. Know what your people are worth. Say it out loud when you need to. The microphone will be warm and the room will be quiet and the words will be enough. Thank you for being here until the very end. If this story reached something real in you, tell me in the comments. Tell me about your table 11. Tell me what you wish you had said, or what you said that changed something. I read every single one. I will see you next time.